In a report to Congress, John Quincy Adams is recorded saying, quote, "Weights and measures may be ranked among the necessities of life to every individual of human society. The importance of measurements lies in the amount of times they are used daily, thus making the apparatus for measuring, the system of measurement, equally essential." In the late 1970s, after centuries of perpetual discord, conflict between the United States government and American labor broke out regarding the newly passed Metric Conversion Act, which called for the replacement of the U.S. customary system with that of the metric system. A failure to compromise on behalf of both opposing parties has paradoxically had both little and great effect on American life overall, leaving the United States as one of 8 officially non-metric countries and allowing for residual dissension to continue into the present day.
You find it easier to use a meter and kilogram. Be a smart citizen and use the number 10.
The United States customary system began in England as a conglomeration of many other systems of weights and measures. This created a convoluted system that utilized fractional quantities and had no set standards. Without a definite standard, fraudulency became a commonality in trade. Eventually, English monarchs established definite measures which lessened but did not extinguish fraud. Other European countries shared similar issues. Consequently, the Paris Academy of Science developed the International System of Units in the late 17th century, which they believed could become a universal system which would encourage international trade. The International System of Units would become known as the metric system, featuring a base of 10 and decimalized quantities. On January 8, 1790, President George Washington addressed the need for an established system of measurements in the newly formed United States of America. He tasked Thomas Jefferson with deciding the system. Jefferson suggested the use of the metric system. However, Congress disregarded this proposal along with further requests from Washington, because they did not feel that it was a priority in the newly formed country. On April 7, 1795, the metric system was legalized in France after several years of refinement. However, this was heavily opposed by French commoners. Shortly after, the French Revolution began, which saw the metric system abandoned until spontaneous adoption in the 1830s. As France became increasingly metric, other surrounding European nations began to convert to the system. Due to this large-scale conversion, the United States authorized use of metric units in 1866, but because this legislation was neither promotional nor mandatory, it was largely disregarded. 9 years later, the U.S. took part in the Diplomatic Conference on the Meter in Paris and became a signatory to the Treaty of the Meter, which established America as an officially metric nation. However, due to the public's refusal to use the metric system, metrication was soon abandoned. In 1876, the first metric advocacy group was established. The American Metric Bureau advocated for legislation declaring the metric system the sole system of measurement in the U.S. 3 years after this, the International Institute for Preserving and Perfecting Weights and Measures was established as the first organized metric opposition. By the 1890s, dissension had grown. The most notable oppositional movement was led by Frederick Halsey and Samuel Dale, who presented works to Congress that detailed the failings of the metric system and the ways in which it would harm American industry. Together, Halsey and Dale founded the American Institute of Weights and Measures, which was backed with the support of several industries. In the early 20th century, several federally funded groups were created, including the National Bureau of Standards and the American Metric Association. In 1929, the Great Depression began, which effectively silenced the metric debate, and as the economy grew through World War II, metrication did not seem necessary to most. However, when the pharmaceutical industry converted to the metric system in 1956, quickly and easily, this opinion began to change. In 1968, the Metric Study Act was passed, beginning the U.S. Metric Study, which aimed to address the concerns of industry workers and advise the government on the best course of action regarding conversion. The study concluded in 1971. It stated that some industries were willing to convert while others were very opposed to conversion. The study also found that metrication would aid the economy, as it would allow the U.S. to trade more vigorously with foreign nations. In line with this, the study suggested converting within the following 10 years. By this time, many other countries had converted or were in the process of converting due to various reasoning. However, the American people maintained that the metric system was not needed in the U.S., as the U.S. customary system had allowed the economy to flourish. Most international trade was bulk measured items, and most trade was with the British Commonwealth, which had not yet converted to the metric system. Then, in the early 1970s, the British Commonwealth announced plans to convert to the metric system. This announcement did little to change the minds of Americans, though. Regardless, this did resonate with legislators. In 1974, the Metric Conversion Act was introduced in the House of Representatives. The Metric Conversion Act declared the metric system the, quote, preferred measurement system in the United States, but stressed that conversion was completely voluntary. In addition, this legislation would create the U.S. Metric Board, which would be responsible for aiding companies in the process of conversion, but stressed that it was not an advocacy group. In the House, the Metric Conversion Act was heavily opposed because metrication would require federal compensation for workers expenses. The most aggressive opposition, though, came from labor unions. The core issue for labor was the belief that conversion would lead to widespread job loss. Most speculated that workers would be unable to learn the new system quickly enough and be put out of work, that metrication would make it easier for jobs to be placed on cheaper foreign soil, and that they would not be fully reimbursed by the government for conversion costs. At this time, some industries began converting to the metric system, such as soft drink manufacturers and oil corporations. However, the majority of the labor force remained opposed to metrication. In 1975, the Metric Conversion Act was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. Though the purpose of the act was to aid labor unions, most industry workers did not believe that it would and thus opposed it.
A lot of the backlash also was orchestrated by American labor, which saw it as part of a move to make it more easy to shift jobs offshore.
Despite most labor unions sharing these similar thoughts, an organized opposition was never established as, in addition to these reasons, other industry-specific rationality prevented a collective statement. Though never unifying under one organization, each industry took a similar approach to opposition, as rather than aggressively protest, they simply refused to use the metric system, and because conversion was officially voluntary, the government could not force conversion. As an increasing number of industries refused to use the metric system, the U.S. Metric Board and the National Bureau of Standards became more aggressive in their advocacy to promote the metric system. Advertisements could be found in a variety of forms. Due to the increasing advocacy by the U.S. government and the refusal of labor unions to use the metric system, conflict intensified. Where one entity saw exponential economic growth, the other saw a great loss of American jobs, and neither side was willing to compromise on such important issues. As tensions mounted, average citizens began voicing their opinions. Those that supported metrication contended that it would facilitate increasing international trade, that the metric system was more rational than the customary system, and that those who opposed conversion were too patriotic. However, those that opposed metrication claimed that it would not encourage trade, that the customary system was more rational and compatible with human experience, that conversion posed a threat to national security, that those who supported conversion were unpatriotic, and that metrication simply was not necessary. In 1978, the U.S. Metric Board faced criticism for its part in advocating for the metric system, as it was designed to be objective regarding conversion. In response, rather than seek negotiation and compromise, the board claimed that it, quote, lacked the clear congressional mandate necessary to bring about national conversion. As a result, governmental pressure reduced, lessening conflict. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan disestablished the U.S. Metric Board as it was no longer necessary due to the lack of interest in metrication and allowed the Department of Commerce's metric program to take up its mantle. Its advocation led to the passage of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, which amended the Metric Conversion Act. The 1988 legislation added several paragraphs which stated that America was at a growing disadvantage in foreign markets due to its continued use of the customary system and suggested metrication. Although this legislation was largely ignored by labor unions and the public alike, it was successful in complete governmental conversion. For the following years, conflict between metric advocates and critics was almost non-existent until September 23, 1999, when NASA's Climate Orbiter crashed to the surface of Mars. It was quickly determined that the orbiter crashed because the engineers for the project used English units, whereas the operators of the orbiter used metric units. This reignited conflict, as many believed that had the U.S. converted in the 1970s, this costly accident would not have occurred. Today, the U.S. is one of only 3 developed nations to use customary units. Vestiges of the conflict and absence of compromise between the U.S. government and labor can be seen in varying industries. Some industries that did not contest conversion strongly have converted, such as food industries in which soft drinks and alcohol are sold by liters. Some argue that this is evidence which demonstrates that America, whether officially or not, is a metric country. However, other industries that strongly oppose conversion have done very little to become metric, such as the jewelry industry, which continues to sell jewels by carats. Due to America's failure to adopt the metric system, many individuals of other nationalities regard Americans as stubborn, lackadaisical, ignorant, and too patriotic and individualistic. Over time, conflict lessened substantially, becoming more akin to debate. Rationalizations have maintained many original ideas, but have also expanded to include new technology and industries. In short, following centuries of debate and mild conflict in regards to metric conversion, the Metric Conversion Act was passed, which became a catalyst for several years of conflict between the United States government and labor unions. The labor union's opposition was characterized by whole industrial entities independently refusing to use the metric system. The government responded by fiercely advocating for metric conversion using intense propaganda campaigns. After several years of conflict, the U.S. government and labor unions alike abandoned metrication rather than seeking negotiation and compromise. Both parties' failure to compromise has made America one of 3 non-metric developed nations, which has had numerous effects on American industry and society. Because a resolution was never achieved, whether 1975 conversion was in America's best interest or not continues to be debated throughout the country. Overall, the conflict between labor unions and the American government in the 1970s regarding metrication and the failure to compromise has played a substantial role in making American industry what it is today, even if that means allowing it to remain fairly unchanged.
Good grief, who can keep track of the inch and foot, yard and rod, league and mile, teaspoon, tablespoon, pint and quart, bushel and a peck, not to mention avoir, du pois,